So in this video, we'll look at inference questions, and inference questions are kind of a sibling to the according to or specific detail questions that we looked at in the previous video. So with inference questions, your task is to find the answer to a question about something that is implicitly stated in the passage. So implicitly as opposed to explicitly, which is the case with the specific detail questions. So keywords that tell you that you're dealing with an inference question include suggests, implied, can be inferred, and most likely. And so the correct answer to these questions should be based on something that you can directly point to in the passage. So the correct answer might not be a direct paraphrase of that, but you still want to make sure that your answers are based on evidence from the passage. And a key distinction to make here is the distinction between inferring and assuming. And again, we want to remember to find the evidence and not just say, I guess this is in there or this could be in there. So what do we mean by the distinction between inferences and assumptions? Let's look at an example. Let's just say somebody stated that John practiced shooting three-pointers for at least an hour every day during the off season. So he's a dedicated basketball player. He practices three-point jumpers for an hour every day during the off season. Well, it would be an assumption that he's a gifted three-point shooter, meaning that he's, exceptionally talented in that area, but it's an inference that he is dedicated to improving as a three-point shooter. Why is it an inference? Because we have direct evidence that he spent time every day working on this. So that would be an inference as opposed to a mere assumption. Another example, the store's revenue is down nearly 50% for this quarter compared to the same quarter last year. Okay, it would be an assumption that the store is in danger of going out of business because we don't know how much money they have in the bank, but it would be an inference that the store has struggled this year compared to last, at least this time of this year compared to last. So again, we want to make inferences, not assumptions. Often, incorrect answers will be based on assumptions, things that could be true but don't have evidence to support them, or to contradict them for that matter, but what we're interested in is the support. So the strategy for dealing with inference questions is quite a bit like the strategy for dealing with detail questions. So we want to use the question stem as a prompt for scanning through the passage. We want to locate the evidence that answers the question. It could be multiple pieces of evidence if it's a check all that apply question. I'm going to come up with an approximate answer and then select the answer choice that best matches your approximate answer. So let's look at our first example. We've already read this passage in the video on specific detail questions, so if you haven't watched that one, you can either go back and watch it, or you can pause this and take a minute to read the passage. But we'll just go on to the question, and the question asks the following. The author suggests which of the following about most classical composers of the early 1920s. So it's another check all that apply question. So we want to scan through the passage and find where it talks about classical composers of the early 1920s. And we see a couple of potentially relevant pieces of information. One of them comes in this first sentence. The idea that blending these musical elements was not entirely new, that a couple of composers had already composed classical works that incorporated elements of jazz. Now, what can we infer here? The idea that it was not entirely new suggests that it was mostly new, right? It's not entirely new, it's mostly new. It's kind of like if somebody walked out of a movie theater and you ask them, hey, how was that movie? Oh, it wasn't entirely awful. You would infer that it was mostly awful. So the same idea here, not entirely new, mostly new. And then the second sentence says that Johnson was more experienced than most classical composers with jazz, blues, spirituals, etc. So if he was more experienced than most, that means the others were less experienced than he was. Okay, so now we turn our attention to the answer choices. The first one, they were strongly influenced by the musical experiments of Milhaud and Gershwin. We don't see evidence of that. So that's one of those things that could be true, but that would be based on an assumption that we don't have any direct evidence for. The second choice, they had little working familiarity with such forms of American music as jazz, blues, and popular songs. Well, we can get that from this part. So he was more experienced than most. That means most of them didn't have a lot of experience with these forms of music. And so that would be a good option to pick. The next one, they made few attempts to introduce innovations into the classical symphonic tradition. And here we have to be careful. While this certain blend of musical elements that they talk about was not entirely new, that doesn't mean that there weren't other innovations that they might have been trying to introduce, speaking about classical composers as a whole. So this one is not supported by the evidence in the passage. So even though we were able to pick out a couple of statements that could have potentially corresponded to correct answers, only one of the three options actually is correct, and that's going to be the middle one. So let's look at a second example. Again, we read this passage in the previous video, so if you haven't watched that video, again, you could either go back to that or you can pause this one. But in any event, we'll go right to the question. Another check all that apply question. Another one that uses the word suggest. So again, that tells us we're dealing with an inference question. So what can we infer about two planets that formed in close orbits and engaged in slingshot activity? So first thing we want to find is a reference to slingshot activity. And we see above that, and why do we look above it? Because it says this slingshot activity. That implies that they've already talked about that, or at least alluded to it. So comets were gravitationally flung into their present-day elliptical orbits when they ventured too close to planets. Okay, so astronomers suspect that pairs of planets also engage in this slingshot activity, and when they do so, one will be scattered inward toward its star and the other outward. They will likely then travel close enough to neighboring planets to disturb their orbits also. So what can we identify here? Well, they affect each other's orbits. They cause them to engage in these elliptical orbits as opposed to circular orbits. One will be scattered inward, the other outward. And then they'll travel close enough to neighboring planets to disturb their orbits also. So turning our attention to the answer choices, one will be scattered inward and the other outward. That corresponds to this first choice. Deflect away from each other. One in, one out, that means away. They will change the shape of each other's orbits. That corresponds to this part. And then they will affect the orbits of neighboring planets. That corresponds to that part. So what we find here is that all three of them are correct. And that will sometimes happen, so don't be spooked by that. Sometimes all three of them will be correct. You just have to consider them individually and assess them on their own merits. So all three of them are correct in that case. Let's look at a third and final example for this video. This is part of a longer passage that we haven't read, but we'll go ahead and just read this paragraph and address this question. We'll see more of this passage later on in a subsequent video. Isadora Duncan's masterly writings on the dance reveal the depth of her determination to create a lyric form of the art that was free of characterization, storytelling, and the theatrical exhibition of skills. She wished to discard the traditional methods and established vocabularies of such dance forms as ballet and to explore the internal sources of human expressiveness. She shunned bodily ornamentation and strove to use only the natural movements of her body, undistorted by acrobatic exaggeration and stimulated only by internal compulsion. In her recitals, Duncan danced to the music of Beethoven, Wagner, and Gluck, among others, but contrary to popular belief, she made no attempt to visualize or interpret the music. Rather, she simply relied on it to provide the inspiration for expressing inner feelings through movement. She did not regard this use of music as ideal, however, believing that she would someday dispense with music entirely. That day never came. Okay, so it's an inference question. We know that because of this word implies. So what does the author imply? She relied on music in her recitals in order to do what? So we're going to find that down here, and we see the word relied. So that's our clue. She relied on the music to provide inspiration for expressing inner feelings through movement. So that's going to form the basis for our approximate answer, to provide inspiration for expressing feelings. A, we see this word solely, and we'll talk about extreme words later on, but that allows us to eliminate A. When you see an extreme word like that, it's probably going to be incorrect. To foster the illusion that music serves as an inspiration for dance? Nope. To inspire the expression of inner feeling when she danced? The expression of inner feeling, provide inspiration for expressing feelings? That is a pretty close match. Validate the public belief that music inspires so she's not worried about validating a public belief. And then counter the public belief that she made no attempt to visualize music. So again, there's another one of those extreme words. So we have that. So a little bit of an odd case of an inference question that turns out to be a really close paraphrase of something in the passage. But better to have a close match than to have an answer choice that's based on some assumption that's not in the passage at all. Okay, so that'll do it for this video on inference questions. In the next video, we'll talk about questions involving function or purpose.